Taking a piss.
Tell you about the risk I took. With them from me to war zone dogs, or bro stepping with his kitchen talk. I don't trust bitches cause these stitch men up beats. You know I rip them up. You know I rip them up. Watch me go on bare on stage, I'ma blow this year, I'm gonna turn the page. I'm getting rid of the negative energy, I need peace on burning sage.
Their accent's too cold.
Melanin one bag just like Kalani, Beyonce or Riri. Jazzy my skiwi, love me like Kiki, pom pom taste like kiwi. My old thing dry like seaweed. I thought I'd find me a goldfish until I broke my bread like Hovis, split that sea like Moses.
We need to speed the beat up though. 200, yeah?
From 180 to 200. That's a mad jump.
We getting ton up, all this money have to run up. If you been banging in these streets, then put your gun up. Unless you talking facts in your tracks, then please shut up. Monday chick, she a toasty one. Friday chick, she a wetty one. I call it Evian. Slide in and slide out, it's a techie one. Piling and ride out, it's a steppy one. Can't trust the soul, got me moving like Tariq, feeling like Mourinho. It's trouble if I speak. Pressure makes diamonds or knees go weak. There's power in my pen and that's the company I keep.
If you're standing at the back, then you should be ashamed of yourself. The girls kept you fine and you came for the girls. Have a good time, tunnel eye, no one else. What happens in Leeds, like a key, never tells. Never press the ball, lots of nights in the bed. And if you trust shuts down, hope you set a fade. Barely bad in the game, got a night to remember Sunday.
From the scene and taking a shot at your so-called gangsters, actors and ops. They don't want to respect the game, so I detect the aim. I should do it for the fame and grub. Show them the levels and gauge and images without competing with a soul, it's nuts. Now I'm going full throttle, foot down on the pedal headlines, and when I'm in the club, stand up. I can see your mind, it's like your senses hazy. Everything you're learning from is written in the dark. Hazy, a shame we have to part like Noah's Ark.
Finish it, bro.
Steez, just made I'm Eddie. Freeze, I mean, he might bleed. Everywhere that I go read. Everywhere that I go, you know. Who knew doing things to fool the media would make us new fools? Doesn't mean we scrap the couple's channel sitting on YouTube. Tired of this YouTube, here's a tissue, boo-hoo. She don't have a blues clue, so welcome to the new school. Here's a session, new rules. You don't make no plans for us, your last one was just awful. I'd rather dodge the evil eye, listen twice cause people lie. Conversation makes it easier to realize we're doing things subtle. Old problems, new bottle. Turn around full throttle until she wants cuddles. And I ain't trying to be no role model, cause the public love to muddle. Now her eyes turn to puddles, but she claiming that they're now we're both so faded.
Go play these situations.
Singing with the gals is back. Right, let's go.
Once upon a time, we were subservient to men. Our roles go beyond the cooking and cleaning. We make a house a home, you see us women have meaning. And every other month, you see our coochies be bleeding. And that's a different type of pain, but we charge it to the game. The cost of being a woman, we can never be replaced.
I pulled up on the block with bro. It was love when I landed. Don't ask me the silliest questions, I won't give you the silliest answers. Grew up with the drilliest guys, really posted with the gangsters. I'm on the motorway getting fried. She thinks I'm in a club with the dancers. I paint pictures on the canvas. I'm delivering hits, bangers. I'm with a hit squad, that's standard. I'm on the telly now, I've expanded. If it don't make peace, then it don't make sense. If I step with my boys, then it's meant to we step with the toys. You get drenched, got bro on the wing like Ryan Kent. If it don't make peace, then it don't make sense. If I step with my boys, then it's meant to we step with the toys. You get drenched, got bro on the wing like Ryan Kent.
I popped off, but my brother said don't let these zombie rappers or these slappers cause me grief. I'm top notch. Who the fuck you thought I was is a reflection, but this vibe is not for free. Took my watch off. I ain't got no time. I guess you thought it was a game, but I'm not willing to compete. I popped off.
Yeah, that little bit. That little bit there. That move there.
You've got a big head like Heady, but clearly you're not the one. You're not the six. You can get dusted in this by the time that doubles. I'm not talking about cleaning products. When I say I'm gonna vanish him, look, sit down. Cause in the last challenge, fumbled. This is my ring, Royal Rumble. I'm sending you back to Cameroon, go back to the jungle.
Wow.
Working on my
my shoulders how they gotta be up to standards. Cause I'm falling as a soldier, they dropped in these stupid rankings. It's why I touch my pen crying, putting pressure on myself. Cause for Congo I'ma die on, fighting on the cameras. Losing ain't an option, cause the news ain't on our side. Ask Patel and ask Biden. I'm still thankful for my mum and her husband. Seen them put that work in, I'll do the same for my brothers, friends, family, those in my generation who love me. Shit ain't funny how I hold the whole weight of a country.
I'm that PIMP, call me 50. Representing the 68 minus 60. On job, I got these galley moving shifty. Nervous, Viagra falls when I reel up these verses. Shout out Leeds, we came here to plant the seeds. It's a rap game first, we fill it by any means. White boy with flavor, your baby mom's favorite. You know I keep my business on low.